Good evening, everyone. So, I'm just making this video on caffeine, and specifically caffeine consumption in adolescent and college student groups. And this is in order to share some of the findings I've made, given some of the research currently out there. Now, why I chose caffeine specifically is because caffeine is everywhere, from energy drinks, coffee, tea, to the food and soda served at fast food venues. And furthermore, when surveyed, about a third of people, so about one third here, ages 12 to 24 reported that they regularly consume caffeinated beverages. So clearly, caffeine consumption is a widespread and potentially a mass issue. So, caffeine consumption is notable. It's the most studied drug in the world. Yet, many people forget that it's a drug by nature and that many can and have formed addictions and dependencies on caffeine. Because caffeine is addictive and potentially harmful at high doses, a limit has been placed for certain age groups. So, among adults, the limit is 400 milligrams per day, recommended by the FDA, while the limit for adolescents, it ranges from essentially no caffeine to upwards of 100 milligrams per day. Either way, it's already recommended that adolescents do not indulge much in caffeine. Before we get into the research, I want to describe a little bit about what caffeine is and what it does to the brain. So, caffeine is responsible for blocking the A2A adenosine receptor, which decreases adenosine in the brain. And adenosine, which is a byproduct of continuous ATP hydrolysis, also acts as a signal responsible for inducing drowsiness. When caffeine binds to the A2A adenosine receptors, what results is increased alertness, better focus, lessened drowsiness, better memory, improved mood, and general improvements to cognitive functioning. So it's understandable why adolescents, college students, and adults alike drink caffeinated beverages. However, adolescents lack judgment and control over themselves, making them easily exploitable. College students must also be aware of where caffeine consumption falls into their daily habits, as depending on how much caffeine they drink and at what times they drink it, it can be very detrimental. So, with that, in my research, I chose 5 variables to study, and these include weight gain, alcohol, substance issues, mental health, sleep, and brain development. And I sort of lumped alcohol and substance issues together as one topic. And I chose these specifically because they all relate back to the lives of adolescents and college students, and because in some way they all relate back to one another. So, starting with sleep, the first thing I'll note is that generally caffeine consumption later in the day will affect the total hours slept and the quality of your sleep. And one particular study that was conducted by Caroline Kuzik, who is a graduate student in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Virginia Commonwealth University, the study shows adolescents with ADHD were about 2.47 times more likely to consume food or beverages containing significant doses of caffeine in the afternoon or evening. This individual also stated that there was no significant associations found between caffeine use in the afternoon and evening and lessened sleep time or wakefulness after sleep onset in either of the adolescent groups with or without ADHD. Now I'm going to quickly define wakefulness after sleep onset, which we have abbreviated here. And that is a metric of the number of times someone wakes up during the night. And during those times, how long they stay awake for. And Kuzik et al. Noted, however, that subjective experiences of sleep and or behavioral sleep functioning could be more impacted by caffeine consumption rather than total sleep time. So by this study, it was suggested that total sleep time was not affected in adolescent groups. Yet, results of a study conducted by Charles Polak, who is a researcher in the Division of Sleep Medicine, found that caffeine consumption was related to increased wakefulness after sleep onset and to more disturbed sleep. And building on these findings, Rebecca Orbera, who is affiliated with the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, found a similar result in her study. And her study differed, however, in that she measured how tired children feel after waking up. as well as how difficult it was for children to fall asleep when treated with caffeine. And it turns out the caffeine group had more trouble falling asleep at night, and that the activation energy, so to speak, for the caffeine group to get out of bed and start their day was much higher than the control. So, moving on to mental health. A researcher by the name of Ana Paula Ardeas conducted testing on adolescent rat subjects that were about 28 days old. And this testing evaluated anxiety related behaviors through an elevated plus maze test, which is a test where rats are placed in the center of an enclosure, and on one side there's a set of open arms, and on the other there are closed arms. So generally, a tendency to move to closed arms is recognized as an increased anxiety profile. So increased, increased anxiety. And in the study, it was found that adolescent rats that were subjected to low, moderate, and high doses of caffeine all tended to spend more time in the closed arms. And moreover, to explore this relationship, some survey data among college students has been collected. So specifically in a group of Florida State University students, most of the reports indicated a significant relationship between anxiety and caffeine consumption. And now that's bad enough, but some of the data also indicated an increased likelihood of depressive symptoms, and that includes poor appetite, overeating, sleep complications, and a depressive mood. All of these drawbacks were observed at a greater rate in the caffeine group, so to speak. Now, this isn't to say that caffeine is all terrible. As a matter of fact, it's been noted that lower doses of caffeine can have a therapeutic effect when it comes to anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. So it's just a matter of dosage, and that's part of the issue. Adolescents and college students are far less likely to be able to moderate their caffeine intake, so we see a lot of mental health complications in those groups. It's more important for them to realize what kind of risks they're subjecting themselves to and what path they might be going down when they repeatedly consume caffeine. So now we're going to touch on brain development, and this is mostly with respect to adolescent groups. Now, for brain development, generally caffeine consumption appears to alter brain chemistry and can maybe even lead to impairment in developmental processes. So before we move forward, I'm just going to define a few of these terms off to the side. So neuronal cells here propagate electrical signals in the brain, and glial cells over here play a role in brain signal moderation. And so those cells work together to coordinate brain function. Obviously, that means they're important. And so when some professionals note that both of these cells in the immature brain are at an immense state of vulnerability from energy drink consumption, there's a lot of concern in that because this means that caffeine may potentially be leading to the death of important neural cells. So, along with this, we also have purinergic signaling. This type of signaling is responsible for coordinating cell behaviors, and these include reproduction, differentiation, migration, and apoptosis, which is cell death. And so, in the context of childhood development, tampering with these processes might lead to issues with brain development, as well as positive cognitive impairment, or possible cognitive impairment, or in particularly extreme cases, neurological or psychiatric complications. Also, and what I'm about to say will make sense in a moment, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommends that pregnant women consume no more than 200 milligrams of caffeine per day. Well, why? So essentially, a negative correlation between caffeine consumption during pregnancy and IQ and subsequently birthed children has been found, which, along the fact that this is highly disturbing, it once again suggests caffeine severely tampers with brain development. IQ in actually birthed children and death potentially for 1 and 2, as well as an impairment to 3. So now we move on to alcohol and substance issues. And I'll start by saying that mixing caffeinated beverages with alcohol has become an increasingly common practice in adults and college students, even to the point where several studies attempt to find how significant of a role caffeine plays in these substance related issues. So, these experts have noted several side effects relating to combined caffeine consumption with alcohol, such as a desire to consume more alcohol, a greater likelihood to drive after drinking, and a greater likelihood in the future to use other substances such as marijuana, ecstasy, cigarettes, and even cocaine. Now, that is in respect to college students. So, what about the adolescent side? Well, it turns out that for one, adolescents consuming more than one energy drink per week were also consuming soft drinks daily, alcohol on a weekly basis as well, and they were also having excessive screen time and late bedtimes, which, as discussed before, is problematic because these adolescents need their sleep. And so, on top of this, going back to the rats, the subjects treated with an energy drink and alcohol combination showed a significant preference for alcohol. For alcohol. And you may be thinking, why is this? Well, in general, alcoholism is greater in those pairing it with caffeine because caffeine tends to mask the effects of alcohol by making the user seem more alert and unimpaired than they actually are. And so, plenty of research supports that caffeine in conjunction with alcohol can lead to several severe alcohol related issues. And some research has suggested a correlation with caffeine and drug issues. But drug issues is a very extreme leap, and really more research should be done to support this idea. So I'm just going to fill in the blanks here. Drug issues and alcohol abuse, and a greater likelihood for drunk driving incidents. And so lastly, we're going to discuss weight gain or obesity. Now, whether or not caffeine consumption correlates to obesity or weight gain, it's unclear. And partly this is because obesity and weight gain is a very complex process that involves a large number of variables at play. So it's really difficult to concretely say whether caffeine consumption has a significant effect, especially because of the research done in support of the idea that caffeine promotes weight loss, which of course is the opposite of our variable here. So now going back to the mouse study conducted by Ardais et al., in this study, no significant difference was found in body weight between the adolescent rats that were treated with caffeine and the adolescent rats that did not receive caffeine. And these rats, for those wondering, were monitored over 25 days. And they were roughly the same as each other in body weight. And now, even worse for our purposes, but of course better overall, caffeine appears to really be helping consumers to lose weight. And yes, this is in the context of those trying to lose weight, so perhaps this is not very noticeable in adolescents. But in any case, to quote the findings of Reza Tabrizi, who is an assistant professor of epidemiology and a researcher at the Non-Communicable Diseases Research Center, she essentially found in her study that with every doubling in caffeine intake, the average reduction in weight, BMI, and body fat doubled in tested subjects. So for every doubling of caffeine, these all doubled as well in reduction. But even if this study is applicable to adolescents, it really isn't advisable for adolescents to go on diets because, of course, they're still growing. Reducing calories might affect their growth, and having weight loss happen at a fast rate would undoubtedly complicate their development. And now, don't get me wrong, weight loss is certainly encouraged if the child is far above the healthy weight they should be at. But their weight loss at such a young age, at the very least, needs to be gradual. And caffeine, although it helps us adults lose a few pounds, will not do adolescents any favors. And now, these findings are not the end all be all, as there are some studies that hint at caffeine contributing to weight gain in adolescents. One of these was conducted by one David McCormick, who is a pediatrician and is affiliated with the University of Texas. And in this study, he monitored the dietary habits of children ages 24 to 36 months, so a rather young crowd. But altogether, he found that of these children, 42%, oops, 42% became overweight or obese. And of all the children, about 58% of these children were consuming caffeine at an average of 0.48 milligrams per kilogram per day. And now, what's even worse is that the study also found there was a high correlation between caffeine intake, weight gain, and nutrient deficiency. This is compared to children who were not eating or drinking caffeinated products. So, what this translates to in numbers is that the children would ingest 121 more calories per day and 3.8 grams less protein. Which over time is a very big difference. But altogether, in this front, more research should be done. And in particular, some questions like maybe does caffeine increase cravings, or do people who consume caffeine have a tendency to consume less nutritious foods? Those kinds of questions should be asked. And to sort of wrap this up, I want to ask the question, what does this all mean? Well, energy drink companies are projected to make $60 billion in the next decade. And so they're massive companies. We can't really expect a quick change to happen where all of a sudden energy drinks are not allowed to be sold to minors. And what's more is caffeine is still everywhere. It's difficult to really pass any laws that would adequately prevent minors from having caffeine. So if that's the case, what do we do? Well, it's still important to remember the role parents and healthcare providers have in child's dietary habits. So maybe providers can alleviate this by more frequently screening for caffeine addiction, and of course by educating parents on the risks of caffeine consumption in their children. I do also believe that teachers can play a role in the regulation process, as we find that a lot of this caffeine abuse, especially in college students, occurs in scholastic settings. But most importantly, parents must be more involved and alert about this aspect of their child's diet. Having them be more educated about how caffeine affects their children, of course, can help. But generally, what parents need to watch out for is caffeine addiction in their kids. It's all too common for children to form addiction to caffeinated products, and that can seriously harm them if they're not careful. But now I will say this, companies still have a responsibility to uphold. And some companies, and of course their marketing practices, are borderline exploitative, namely Prime, who heavily markets to children as the main audience. Like everyone else, they need to be held accountable for their business practices because sometimes they are a big portion of the problem in how kids perceive these drinks. So I hope that all helped, and I hope you learned something new, and have a good day.